and we get together scientists with policymakers and the other kind of leaders. So my role here as a scientist, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the issues that come up for science and drug policy. I mean, in an ideal world, drug science and drug policy, we work as allies, because we, as scientists, can provide an evidence base, which doesn't dictate policy, but it can contribute to it. And also, in an ideal world, drug policy would help facilitate drug science. But as we all know, it doesn't really happen like that. At the moment, in the UK especially, drug policy and drug science are more antagonistic. So drug policy is restricting the science. Drug policy largely ignores the drug science. It would rather go to the Daily Mail than it would go to the universities. And also, it's also drug scientists' fault as well. Maybe we haven't learned how to communicate more effectively with policymakers. So that we know various work, especially Dave Nutt's on some pioneering work, trying to get some logic into drug policy, especially the classification of drugs under the UK Misuse of Drugs Act. And so he got together, we've done it various times through Drug Science, the charity, getting experts to come along for free and all rate the harms of different drugs. And consistently, this has been started in the UK, but it's been done in many countries. We had a whole European meeting to do it in 20 European countries, and Canadians have done it in other countries to follow suit. And what is clear from this is that, okay, so when all these hospital experts rate drugs in terms of their relative harms, this is generally the pattern that's emerged in every single country, that alcohol comes out worse, both in terms of, especially in terms of harms to others. Tobacco is fairly high up, and the most widely used illicit drug, cannabis, is quite benign in comparison. And when you look at these rankings in comparison to the Misuse of Drugs Act in the UK, there's no relationship whatsoever. For those of you who've done statistics, the correlation is almost zero. So there's no relationship at all. So the Misuse of Drugs Act doesn't classify drugs by their harms, which is what it originally intended to do. It's just a historical mess. And many Schedule I drugs are potential treatments. So cannabis and cannabinoids, I'm working with a lot in the group at UCL, that they can be useful as a certain minority of people with chronic pain who don't respond to opiates, but they do respond to cannabis. There's also, there are already cannabinoid medicines like Sativex and Dronabinol that have been used and are available on the NHS. For multiple sclerosis, cannabis is shown to be effective with spasticity. Childhood epilepsy is now responding to one cannabinoid in the plant. There's some evidence now ecstasy can be helpful in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, and Dave Nutt and his group have been working on psilocybin, magic mushroom, showing it can help people who don't respond to any other form of antidepressant. Is that 10 minutes? And also in the States, people have been using LSD for terminal illnesses, people with anxiety, prior to death. But all these drugs are in Schedule I of the Medicines Act. And Schedule I means that there's no recognised medical use of that drug. So in fact, what it's doing is tying researchers' hands behind their backs. It's so hard to research them. I'm lucky I've got a Home Office licence. There's hardly anyone who has got a Home Office licence to use these drugs in humans. Even Dave Nutt doesn't. So he has to use my licence to do his work. But it's still, even with the licence, you're jumping over hurdles all the time. So at the moment, we're using an element of cannabis to treat cannabis dependence, and we're having to pay more than £100,000 for that treatment. Another one where we're just doing a placebo cannabis experiment. We would import our cannabis because we haven't got medical cannabis in the UK. We have to import it from the Netherlands. And placebo, inactive cannabis, I had to pay over £1,000 for 3 grams. I mean, how much does weed cost on the street? And that's got an active element in it. But the Home Office rules are that any active ingredient in our placebo, it's less than 0.1%, you have to have an import and export license, and that can take 3 months. So you wasted a lot of money and a lot of time. Dave Nutt's psilocybin and depression research, he took 2 years to get a supply of psilocybin that was medically acceptable. I want to give you an example just from cannabis research. Cannabis, as many of you know, has over 100 ingredients, and 2 main ones. THC is the stuff that makes you stoned, and it can make you anxious, and with some people it has psychotic-like effects. CBD is the opposite, so I always think of it as like yin and yang. The THC on one side is counterbalanced by the CBD, which is calming, reduces anxiety, and it may reduce psychotic symptoms, as I'll show you. And cannabis is really important for research because it's told us an awful lot about the brain. Our brain is designed for cannabis. We have cannabis receptors in our brain. We have 2 chemicals that act like cannabis in our brain, anandamide and 2-OG. And we know it's really important in the system in adolescence, which is why we think adolescents are more likely to have negative effects of cannabis, especially psychosis. What's happened over the last few years, as many of you will know, is there's been a huge increase in skunk strains that have high levels of THC on the left, but hardly any CBD, in fact probably none at all. So as it's become really difficult to get any strain other than skunk, what's happening is we're having a parallel increase in the number of under 18-year-olds who are in treatment for cannabis addiction. Cannabis addiction throughout Europe is now the main reason people go into drug treatment. It was never like that in the old days. With the old, nice, balanced cannabis, addiction was unheard of. And also, Marta Di Forti at the Institute of Psychiatry has done some nice work showing that if people smoke high-potency skunk-type cannabis, they're 3 times as likely to develop psychosis. If they smoke the more balanced hash, they don't increase their risk of psychosis. Now, surely that has a public health message. Surely government should be listening to these kinds of facts. And the logic is, if CBD can protect against psychosis, can it treat it? And one study's been done now in Germany showing that CBD from the cannabis plant is as effective as traditional medicines for schizophrenia. Policy implications are that control of the market would promote higher CBD strains, inform users about how much THC is in the stuff they're buying, counsel those who have individual vulnerability factors such as adolescence and perhaps the first-degree relative with schizophrenia. With Molly, we wrote a report trying to persuade government that the first step is to take cannabis out of Schedule 1 and allow medical use in the UK and help UK research. It didn't have a huge amount of impact, I'm afraid. But the benefits are that it would promote human rights. If people do get relief of pain from cannabis, why not use it? Patients would have a nicely balanced THC-CBD content. It would reduce NHS costs because the manufactured cannabis medicines like Sativex are really expensive. They cost about £150 a week to the NHS. Whereas if you import cannabis from the Netherlands, like they do in Austria, like they do in Germany, treatment will go down to £20 a week. It promotes UK research as well. I think, also thinking about drug science and drug policy, it's really important that as scientists we research drug policy, because what's so often happened is that recently the ecstasy coming in from the Netherlands, the strength was doubled, whereas it's normally around 100 milligrams, it went up to about 200 milligrams, which is kind of quite disturbing. So I went on the radio and spoke to a few people in the press, saying that there should be some harm reduction now that the ecstasy pills are so high, so cut them in half and wait a couple of hours to see the effects. The Daily Mail said I was stupid. I got hate mail. Someone threatened to kill me. I mean, it's just an extraordinary situation. And as MDMA is now widely available again, but when it wasn't last year or two, PMA and PMMA came in to take its place, and they were much more dangerous because they took 2 hours to peak in the brain, and kids were thinking, no, it's not working, I'll take another one. And there were deaths because of that. And it's very disappointing closure of fabric, where people did take drugs. It was a kind of international venue, a tourist attraction, and 2 people died. We still don't know what drugs they'd taken, but it's assumed they died of drugs. The government's response was, let's close the club. Instead of saying, let's have on-site drug testing, let's have harm reduction people like they do in other countries there in the clubs and helping out. So thank you, that's just a quick view from science.
Apologies, myself and Baroness Meacher were deciding who would go first because we're not sure who's going to undo the other. But I'm going to try and preempt what she's going to say. Okay. So firstly, thank you so much for the invitation. It is a real honour and a privilege to be here, and with such a distinguished panel of speakers as well. I have to say, I learned tremendously even just from the last presentation. And thank you to the organisers. Before I begin, I want to do a quick, I always enjoy doing a kind of quick straw poll. Hands up here who thinks that the war on drugs was a good idea. I was in a meeting the other day and several people put up their hand. I was kind of surprised. Sorry? And hands up here who thinks the war on drugs was a failure. Okay, so it's pretty, who doesn't have an opinion? And hands up here who watches Narcos. So what I'm going to try to do is bring this way up from what the last presentation was. I'm going to try to bring this up to the international level a bit more, and this kind of idea of a global war on drugs, and where is the international system going. And I'm going to stop there and leave that for Molly to discuss, or Baroness Meacher to discuss in more detail. I'm going to try to talk some more on the supply side. I suspect a lot of people here are actually interested more in the kind of micro-policy issues and the chemical issues and the pharmacological issues. So I hope it's not too boring for you, but we'll see how we get on. What I'm going to highlight is that, as we've seen, there's intense regulatory controls over all aspects of this, whether you're talking about scheduling, whether you're talking about the need to get import and export certificates for certain type of medicines, which prolong how long it takes to get them, makes it more expensive. That's not just on psychotropic research. That's applied across the board. 85% of the world has very minimal access to essential pain medicines like morphine and things like that, because regulations are so strict on these things, and not just at the international level, but at the national levels and local levels as well. And so what I'm just trying to highlight here is this goes back a century. The international efforts to regulate these commodities began around the 1900s. 1909 is generally seen as the starting point. And from the start, you see a confluence of interests. As was said, the idea of a wicked problem. From the start, this was a confluence of interests. Now, I think, I think on both sides, there's been an element of simplicity. On the drug warrior side, it's that we're fighting a moral battle against the evil of drug use. Now, that was one determinant of international drug policy. But another is pharmaceutical interests. Another is genuine government concern to control problematic commodities. Another interest is stupidity, that people, as the best laid plans of international regulators and central planners and things like that often go awry. And unless we understand that extremely complex fabric of international drug regulation, you're not going to start to fix this problem. So it doesn't make sense to just say, well, the UN is just stupid and they're all prohibitionist and it's all just this war on drugs ideology. A lot of that is there, yeah. But a lot of this is an international regulatory system which almost uniformly is perceived as having some utility at the international level. That there isn't a free trade in opiates at the global level. That there are some restrictions on that. And I think as we start to unpick this wicked problem, it is going to be more about finding where the marginal improvements in drug policy are. How do we improve access to research? How do we improve access to drugs so people can research, while taking account of genuine concerns about overly permissive regulatory regimes? The concerns I'm hearing coming from Colorado in the US right now is this is now emerging as a hub of US organized crime. I'm skeptical when I hear those claims. But these are as you see legalized cannabis markets emerge, these are one of the considerations you're going to face. There's going to be pushback from law enforcement agencies, and so you have to have that kind of understanding of how all of these issues intersect and how all of these interests intersect. To set the stage a little bit for Baroness Meacher, I think what we've seen is we had a UN General Assembly special session on drugs in April of this year. It was the first since 1998. And I think the main takeaway from that meeting is that we have shifted drastically away from this idea of a global war on drugs. And we're more now towards an idea, at least in the interim, of policy pluralism. That yes, whatever the international conventions were previously interpreted as saying, different countries are going to try different things. Uruguay is going to legalize cannabis. The US is probably going to legalize cannabis fully within the next 10 years. Canada is probably going to legalize cannabis, so is Mexico. Psychotropics are an entirely different matter, and that's a much more complex picture. But I expect to see coherence at the international level on broad principles, but then more national jurisdictions moving ahead with policy experimentation. Sadly, the UK will probably continue to lag for the foreseeable future, but we can only hope that changes a little bit. So I don't really need to go into this in much detail, but as you said, I've been a part of a number of reports over the last few years, and it's been amazing how rapidly the policy environment has changed. This was the conclusion of our 2014 report. That got 1,000 press hits at least when we put that out. And that was seen as news. Nobel Prize winners say the war on drugs is a failure and we need to move beyond it. That wouldn't be seen as news today because we released this report in 2016 saying roughly similar things. And it didn't get the same level of press attention. Actually, when we talked to press, it said so. We all know that. But the key point of this, I think, especially in this talk, is especially with established drug markets, policing and enforcement is very ineffectual. And yet it remains the default response in most of the world, to be honest, in pretty much all of the world. There's some argument about, well, you know, if you've got newly emerging substances, should the police try head off the emergence of and mark them those? There's some evidence that maybe there's some use for police in that. If they can get the right people at the right time, they can stop certain markets growing. The point of that is, though, that people will take other substances. So you may not actually be reducing the drug problem, you're just displacing them to another potential drug. But overall, the key lesson here is, and if there's any economics people in the room, you're going to find this much easier, but the key lesson here is supply interventions just do not work. So when you hear in the paper that the police have seized how many ecstasy tablets or how many kilos of cocaine, the actual net benefit to society is practically nil. Because this is a commodity and it's subject to the same laws of economics as any other commodity. When you've got demand that is constant and you have a sudden drop in supply, what happens? The price goes up. What happens to suppliers when the price goes up? They decide to supply more. So you see an increase in supply. What happens to the price when the supply goes up? It falls. And you end up at exactly the same point you were prior to the supply intervention. So what we say in economics is you're at an equilibrium that is equivalent to your previous equilibrium. E2 is equal to E1. It has had zero effect, and it has had tremendous high falls. How much police time and effort is spent on these supply interventions? What are the potential political economy impacts? For example, when you take out a key drug trafficker in Mexico, what if the people directly under him go to war over his position? Well, then you get an exponential increase in violence, and that's what we've seen over the last decade in Mexico. So two of the most eminent scholars on this topic did a paper on this in 2014. And effectively what they said is the returns on resource investment is effectively nil or negative. So when UK police are throwing lots of resources after going after a supply side of the drug market, they're having virtually nil effect and may actually be making the problems worse in some cases. Another lesson from the international level then is that public health service responses to drugs are very effective. The UK actually is quite a good example of this. Harm reduction the UK was originally an innovator in harm reduction in the 1980s and the 1990s. But the cost-benefit analysis of things like syringe exchange, just giving people clean needles so that they're not sharing HIV while they're injecting, is extremely cheap and extremely effective. Some studies put it at, $1 invested brings $50, $60, $70 returns, and that's over the short to medium term. Over a lifelong process, it's probably much higher. What that also suggests is, if you're somebody who provides health services, anyone I know who works in the health service side of drug policy will tell you that criminalization and repression is the single greatest barrier to people accessing those health services. You know, there's a notion that, well, you have to have tough love with people, you have to push people before they actually go and seek treatment. And actually, it's the exact opposite. You're dealing with very vulnerable populations that don't have much interaction with public health services. And so by pushing them further away and pushing them further into the margins via criminalization and police repression, you're actually raising the cost of interventions. So you're making, you know, on the health side, you're providing methadone, you're providing treatment services or harm reduction services, and on the other side, you're making those services less effective because you're using the police to push people away from them. And this is something that's well acknowledged in the international literature. If you look at even the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which is traditionally quite conservative on this, or World Health Organizations, UNAIDS, UN Development Program, whoever it is, the general message is move towards decriminalization. Prison is not a place to treat people with substance dependence issues, and you raise the barriers to service provision. I'll finish with just hitting on these points, but as we've seen at the international level, one of the key barriers to reform over the last few decades was, frankly, the United States, I think. The United States was a key protagonist in this idea of the drug war, and it was absolutely unforgiving from anyone who deviated from that course. And I'll just highlight what the US State Department said, or key official in the US State Department said in 2014. If I had heard this was coming in 2012, I wouldn't have believed it. Like, it was impossible to foresee this coming. But because of cannabis legalization, the US had to radically change its tone at the international level. And effectively what they said was, well, yeah, we used to have the war on drugs, but things have now changed. So when they were speaking about the conventions, the International Convention on Drugs, things have changed since 1961. And they said we have to have enough flexibility to incorporate these changes into our policies, to tolerate different national drug policies, to accept the fact that some countries will have very strict drug approaches and other countries will legalize entire categories of drugs. Now, as we enter this period of policy pluralism, or as we're knee-deep in it now, I think that's not a bad way of thinking about this topic. Sadly, places like the Philippines are going to keep doing these things because it plays well to certain domestic audiences. It's seen as being, it's tough man politics, and it's used as effectively power grab mechanisms. It strengthens the president's position because he can use the police and military in certain ways. But I think those kind of policies become less tenable as we go forward, and as more evidence emerges around what works, as more places legalize cannabis and decriminalize consumption, I think repressive drug policies will become less justifiable. So that's why I think this era of flexibility and policy pluralism is probably going to be the most effective way to change the international system. I will finish just thinking about this. Do I have any time, or have I gone over? This idea of legalization. We also need to move beyond this idea of it is war on drugs, or it is absolute libertarian free market legalization, and there is no in between. This should not come as a mystery now, because we've had a lot of debate around marijuana legalization around the world, particularly in the US. But it's that we need to think of this as a spectrum of policies. And that's not me being simplistic about it, well, I'm in the middle, I'm not one of the extreme ends. It's that there quite literally, on every substance, there are an absolute plethora of ways that you can deal with it. And as Kleiman said, as Mark Kleiman said, it was contributed to our 2014 report, just because you start to legalize cannabis doesn't mean you get the Budweiserization or the Marlboroization of that industry. It doesn't need to be large scale, very low productivity or low costs and very high productivity. It can be inefficient, small scale, cooperative models, whatever it is, that don't see prices falling drastically. And basically, if you've got an interest in the substance, you can find a way to get it without going to the black market. And so this is where the debate is starting to move now, I think, beyond the kind of polar extremes and more towards, okay, what are the actual marginal policy improvements? So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.
John didn't use a mic, but I don't know whether you can hear me at the back at all. Can you hear or not really? Yeah. It's just a bit easier if one doesn't use it. So thank you, Dave, very much for organising this event. And I think it's fantastic that there are so many of you here this evening. We were wondering when we walked into an empty room whether there'd be anybody at all. But it's very, very good to see you all. I was asked to consider how drug policy actually gets made and how our work contributes to that policy making. I suppose the question for me is, how is it that a country, a sophisticated country like the UK, has for 45 years had a completely irrational, ridiculous and destructive policy on such an important issue as drugs. It just, you know, confounds one really that this could be possible. We have to go back, I do think we have to go back to the conventions that John, of course, mentioned in detail, because those conventions have actually made it very difficult for member states to move forward. And I see the beginning, although we go back, of course, to 1908 and all the rest of it, the 1961 Single Convention really blew, or started, I would say, the war on drugs. It really did, by prohibiting anyone from producing, selling, possessing, or using any of these controlled drugs, including, as we know, cannabis, cocaine, heroin, and the rest of them. So it was really very, very inflexible. And as I think as Val mentioned, of course, much more dangerous drugs than cannabis, like tobacco and alcohol, remain completely freely available, well, pretty freely available in supermarkets and tobacconists. So the irrationality of that situation defies belief in my view. It's extraordinary. The UN conventions do have an overarching objective to promote the health and welfare of mankind. Excellent, brilliant, you would say. But the people who wrote the conventions decided to have a prohibitionist policy, but they had absolutely no evidence, in my view, that such a prohibitionist policy would actually achieve the final and ultimate objective of promoting the health and welfare of mankind. Indeed, those conventions, as I think we probably all know, judging from the little straw poll we had, they have actually achieved exactly the opposite, have they not? They have increased massively the amount of violence and corruption across the producing countries. They've led to a massive illegal drugs industry. People reckon about $350 billion worth, money going into terrorism, money going into criminal gangs. Is that helping anybody? Certainly it is not. It is absolutely devastating. The prohibition leads to children and young people taking their drugs in secret for years, quite often, without their parents and teachers realizing what they're doing, and only when they are in very real trouble does it come to light, and then of course it's a very, very difficult problem to solve. Drug addiction is an incredibly hard problem, as we all know. So it just doesn't matter which way you look at this, or whether you look at Europe or Latin America, US, it doesn't matter. It's a disaster, utter disaster. So for 45 years we've had this situation. Many other countries actually have challenged those conventions. You've got pretty well the whole of Latin America. They've never criminalized the possession of cannabis, certainly for medical use. They just haven't done that. You've got 24 US states, of course, that have now legalized cannabis for medical use, and number 4 states, I think it is, that are legalizing it for recreational purposes. Also, countries like Canada, Israel, and 11 European countries have also legalized cannabis for medicinal use. Okay, so other countries have been a lot braver than the UK, one has to say. And a different approach has, of course, been Portugal. They have decriminalised the possession and use of all these controlled drugs. Doesn't matter what, heroin, cocaine. If somebody in Portugal is found with one of these drugs, small amount, personal use, they have to hand in their drugs, but then they go off to a tribunal to determine whether they're an addict or not. If they are, they have to go to treatment, and they have a contract for this treatment. And if they breach the contract, then indeed they have an administrative penalty, maybe some community service or whatever. The important point about the Portuguese system is that young people, children, do not pick up a criminal record unless there are complicating factors. And it seems to me that the Portuguese system is one that certainly Britain ought to follow. The big benefit, as I understand it, is that Portugal have lower levels of addiction amongst children and young people than they would have had if they hadn't had decriminalisation. They may have a bit of extra social use. If somebody goes off and has a spliff on Saturday, maybe there are a few more people doing that. But in my view, that doesn't matter. In my view, obviously, others may differ on that point. But in the important, you have to ask, what are the objectives of drug policy? Surely one absolutely fundamental one is to reduce the levels of addiction and, of course, violence, corruption, and the rest of it. UK governments have actually been more influenced by these conventions than some other countries or some other brave politicians, I would say. And the other key influence, certainly in this country, as I think Val mentioned, is of course our press, and in particular the Daily Mail, that has campaigned, and they are vicious if one comes out in favour of any liberalisation of these drug policies at all, as we know well. I would say these have been the main influences really on UK drug policy. Every political party, it's not a party political issue at all, in my experience. So what has changed? John alluded to the United Nations special session of the General Assembly in mid-April, and I would say that the really important thing that happened there was that the very senior officials of the United Nations itself made very clear that in future we want evidence-based drugs policy with public health and human rights at the centre. Now, I never thought I would hear these top people of the UN saying that. I would like to think that my meetings with all those people beforehand made all the difference, but my guess is that actually the existence in post of Barack Obama has been absolutely crucial, and therefore I have great fears about what is going to happen when Obama is no longer there. Although there were people, the Deputy Executive Director of the UNODC said, evidence-based public health policy is here to stay. And my belief is that organisation is now very clear that that is what they will pursue, in a sense, whatever the US get up to. So that's a little bit of a reassurance, perhaps. The other, I think, very important development is the gradual change in the International Narcotic Control Board. They have been the policemen of the international war on drugs. And countries like Switzerland, countries like Portugal, these other countries that have really pushed the boat out and reformed drug policy have come under the most unpleasant pressure from the INCB. And that is now shifting. They are now appointing health people rather than generals and police officers. And again, I'd like to think my meeting with the president of ECOSOC that is in charge of INCB may have had some effect on that, and I'm quite sure it did, in fact. So one way or another, I do believe, since April this year, that if a member state wants to pursue an evidence-based policy, the UN will no longer, I think, interfere and put pressure on that country not to implement that more liberal evidence-based policy. And for me, that's the really crucial thing that happened in April. So now, at the All-Party Parliamentary Group, we've having focused on the international scene for about 7 years, we're turning our attention to the UK, and our first big push is to get very modest cannabis for medical use legalised on the basis that this would be supplied by licensed suppliers, it would come through prescriptions from doctors, and it would be supplied by licensed outlets like pharmacies like that, something like that. We want to follow the German model. Germany are introducing a law exactly to do that. And for us that's very important because the UK will take Germany seriously. They probably wouldn't take us seriously, but I think they'd take Germany seriously. And Italy is doing something similar. So these countries will join all those other European countries in going in that direction. Now we know that 68% of the population support such a reform. 58% of MPs support that reform. So we're going to be pressing for a private member's bill, we're going to have debates, we're going to have meetings with ministers, and we're really going to push to try and get that change. And I'm sure most of you here would say, oh my goodness me, that's pretty modest, isn't it? But believe me, it's very, very difficult to get any change at all. And certainly in the UK, with all our little efforts, the result so far has been nil. So let's see whether we can make one step forward. And that's what we hope to do. Thanks.
So, would you be willing to go next, and then we finish with Max? Sure. Yeah.
I'm not quite up to date. Am I supposed to be using this microphone?
They can hear you.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
What I normally do, I say to people at the back, "Look, come on down, sit at the front." I'm not going to shout, but then as I was the sort of person who, in my youth, certainly went to the back. In my age, I was at the front, for obvious reasons. Okay, look, it's a simple question. I think, are British police wasted on drugs? The answer is yes. Would you like me to expand on that? Or is that good? You've already heard a fair bit of evidence from John and others about how it should be working. And there's no doubt in my mind, from my own personal experience of over 30 years policing, a little bit of experience before that at university, and then subsequently travelling to a large number of countries around the world, that drug prohibition is a hugely costly, counterproductive and harmful failure. And I won't go into all of the reasons why that's the case, but you've heard some of them already. But one of them certainly is that when you start thinking about this so-called war on drugs, it's a war on people. And it's often a war on the most vulnerable, the most needy. And when you start thinking about it, and when I think about why I became a police officer, it was to help people and catch criminals. But almost invariably enforcing the drug laws, certainly at the lower end with users and the like, you're absolutely going against what police should be doing in a moral sense, because police should be supporting people who are in need, not punishing them. And that's the system that's been set up. And to me, it seems to be a disgrace that the police are charged by the current laws and policies to do exactly that and go against what they should be doing, particularly with the state of evidence as it is at the moment, where it is clearly counterproductive and harmful to millions of people throughout the world. Now, I asked myself a couple of questions. Well, Jonathan asked me to send two in, but just in case he didn't ask me, I thought I'd ask them myself and then try and answer them. And the first one is, why is it, given that, why is there no concerted effort by senior police officers to challenge current drug policy? And I think, there are a number of reasons, one of which is that for government, drug policy is actually a low priority. And it's also a high-risk policy area, because Molly mentioned the fact that there is support for change to the current situation in the public. So you ask them the question, should we punish cannabis users? No, we shouldn't. Should we change the laws? Yes, we should. What is your highest priority for government? Education, immigration, health. It's not drugs. So even though the evidence is building, government can successfully ignore that sort of evidence. At least to date they have, robustly and successfully, and we're hearing, hopefully we'll discuss, opportunities for doing something about that. But there's no spontaneous clamour for reform from the public. And that, for me, reflects on the way the police consider this issue themselves. The risks to government, I'll just explore that briefly, the risk to government is that if they propose any change, then there will be an accusation that they're going soft on drugs, and that there will be a kind of a torrent, a deluge of drugs becoming available to the population. Well, I mean, I imagine that most of you probably, not necessarily through personal experience, but understand that there's no difficulty in obtaining drugs at the moment under our enforcement regime. The difficulty you have is getting drugs of a known quality and purity so that you're not in a position to minimise the harm that might accrue. And there's an organisation called Release, you might be aware of, who have advertised, first of all, nice people fake drugs, and also that probably 95% of people who use drugs do not come to any significant harm at all, and yet the law is a blunt instrument, and people like me were charged with prosecuting these people, even though they were doing no harm to themselves or anybody else. But that's a real risk, particularly with the Daily Mail stoking things and other newspapers taking a stance that any change from the current situation would bring disaster. And human psychology is such that change is actually a difficult prospect, and all of us mainly feel comfortable with the status quo. I was once arguing or debating somebody who was a prohibitionist, and he said, you know, all we have to do is go, oh, what might happen? Whereas you have to put forward a complicated evidence-based case for change. And that sadly is what we're dealing with. And the thing is about that, I mean, I don't like that, but that's the reality. It's rather like you may not like the Tories, but if we're going to engage with government-level policymakers over the next 10 years, and possibly more, we're going to be engaging with the Tories. Now, obviously, we could have that argument in another forum, but frankly, it doesn't make any sense. And I know from my experience of some drug law reformers, they say, well, I don't want to engage with the Tories on this. Well, that really, I mean, you think then maybe they have been harmed by their consumption. I mean, we couldn't be softer on drugs at the moment. And I know this from experience. You heard briefly from John about, you know, the negative impact in economic terms of enforcement. It certainly happened. I mean, some of you may be aware there was a lot of gang warfare in Nottingham, and that was because the police arrested a drug dealer, and so there was a fight between different factions, a bloody fight using weapons and guns and the like, to gain control of this market. And one thing that really upsets me about this is that drug law enforcement creates an artificially raised price in the drugs, which means that criminals have a huge financial motivation to get involved in the market. So my action as a police officer enforcing the law was to incentivize criminals to get engaged in this illicit market. But not only that, the Darwinian principle applied, and it was the stupid criminals who got caught, and the clever ones were making shed loads and still operating. And you actually, you know, when you get news stories, you better stop me at some point, because I can get carried away with this. Oh, me too, right, I get moving. You get these news stories about, you know, there's a new method of smuggling drugs or something. But it's quite clear you've just got a really effective market driven by this massive profit. The drug market in the UK is estimated to be about £6 billion a year. It could be more now, and the total global market could be anywhere between $300 and $500 billion a year. So it is definitely big business. So the point is that the police say, well, they can have a cop-out, pun intended, by saying, if it's not an issue for government, why should we bother? Because we've got, you know, so much more important things to be getting on. And frankly, that's fairly legitimate, because when I was a chief constable, and I would say to my colleagues and any minister I could get hold of, or politician or whatever, they would sort of pat me on the head and say, there, Tom, don't worry about that. You know, it's not gonna change. Get on with thinking about something else. Well, I'm a public servant, and I think it's something that I couldn't ignore, which is why I do what I do now. But the police do have a right to exercise discretion. And so there is a glimmer of hope, in case you're thinking this is getting a bit gloomy, because you may have heard of Ron Hogg, who's the Police and Crime Commissioner in Durham, and Mike Barton, who's the Chief Constable there. And they have an overt publicised policy of not going after small home growing of cannabis unless there's a complaint. They think people who have problematic drug abuse, addiction is an interesting term and probably sometimes best avoided, but problematic drug abuse should be helped. For example, prescribed heroin, rather than having to get it off the street with the problems of over 1,000 deaths and rising at the moment, despite the government saying we have a successful drug policy, of people because they're left to the clutches, if you like, of the illicit market. And as I said, the police really aren't stupid. What's the point of wasting time on this? And I think that in some ways it's a pragmatic... When I say they're not stupid, I think the police who think drug law enforcement is a good idea perhaps are stupid. I think an increasing number realise that it isn't effective. But because it's not a government priority, and because they are constantly being praised for arresting dealers and making seizures, completely inappropriate objectives and measures of performance of the police, they will continue to do that. I think we've got opportunities with Mike Barton and Ron Hogg. There are at least 7 other commissioners who think that there's a need for change. I'm not sure if you're aware, the police and crime commissioners are the elected representatives for police force. They took over from the old police authorities. And I think working down that route could be very fruitful. The other thing I just wanted to very briefly raise was the idea that clearly, at the time when you're running out of money, or money is very short, and when the mantra for many years for the police service has been, be efficient, give value for money, be cost effective, successive governments, Gordon Brown was asked face to face by Danny from Transform, will you do a cost effectiveness survey? No, they won't. Bob Ainsworth, who was a Home Office Minister at the time, he was asked this question. He said, well, why would we want to do that unless we were going to legalise drugs? The point is, and he actually changed his mind now, he's an advocate for reform, but the fact is the government know if they did do a cost effectiveness survey, it would overwhelmingly show that drug law enforcement isn't working and it's wasting for the whole criminal justice system perhaps £10 billion a year. So we really are in a very sorry state of affairs, an evidence-free zone. Theresa May, who was obviously Home Secretary, was asked by the Home Affairs Select Committee about 2 or 3 years ago what evidence she had that drug law enforcement was effective. And she said, well, I don't have any, but I think it is. That is the rock-solid evidential basis on which our drug law enforcement policy and law and procedures is based. I think it exposes hypocrisy at the heart of government. And if she still holds that view, I think it shows that we have a real struggle ahead to make progress. I am actually a natural optimist, and frankly, it's low priority and it's high risk. So our job is to raise the priority and to lessen the risk. And if we do that, I think we've got a chance. And if you are interested, my Twitter account is @TomCLloyd. And I'm not one of those people who puts muck out, every day, and I don't tell you what I've had for breakfast. But occasionally I'm told I say something reasonably interesting. But thanks very much for that.
Hello, thanks for coming. I'm a journalist. I'm sorry about that. I'm not a professional speaker or anything. I'm not famous either like these guys. So excuse me if I just read from my brain. This. Right. Yeah. So I just wanted to just tell you who I am. I'm basically a journalist who's been investigating drugs for about 15 years. The last few years for Vice in the UK and in the US as well. I've got a column for Vice called Narcomania, which is a kind of weekly column that looks at the inside stories of the drug world, the kind of stories that you generally don't see in the mainstream press. I also work on TV documentaries. There's one coming up soon on Viceland, which is a new channel that Vice are doing, which is called Black Market, and they did it with the guy from The Wire called Omar. It was quite a good program, so you should watch it. It's about his 2 young heroin users from Holloway. Right, and the reason my column is called Narcomania is because I wrote a book called Narcomania. Why all this Narcomania business? But it was basically, you called it that because it was a play on the original Victorian word, narcomania. It was coined by a addiction specialist called Dr. Norman Kerr to refer to a pathological craving for drugs, a disease that infected the underclasses and some upper class pleasure seekers. But we kind of decided we were going to, why we thought we could do this, but we thought we'd change the meaning of the word just flip it a little bit to the kind of the deeply confused way that drugs are seen by the state, the media and wider society. So that was the kind of the aim of the column, and the aim of the book is to kind of flip things slightly and try and understand the drug world, try and speak to as many drug dealers and drug users and drug cops as possible. So that's why I'm speaking here today, I suppose, because I see myself as someone who understands more the street side of the drug trade. Right, and I just want to just quickly, before we get into the meat of it, I just wanted to quickly sum up this whole thing of, are police wasted on drugs? And just to say that some of them are wasted on drugs. I interviewed a police officer in about 2006 who had just come off a £500 a week heroin and crack habit. She worked for the Met Police, so she was, by day she was arresting drug dealers, then she'd go home and watch TV and get completely out of it. So yeah, and, there are some police officers who are wasted on drugs. I know that's not the topic of the and I have spoken to a lot of police officers in my time, and a lot of them I actually really like. They have said quite a lot of negative things about the war on drugs, which, as has been said, is a war on people. I've spoken to, recently, last month, I spoke to a guy from the National Crime Agency who was telling me that if they stop chasing drug gangs now, nothing will change at all, which is quite a heavy-duty thing for him to say. And I was like, what? But yeah, that's what he said. I've also been around kind of police officers in Soho with sniffer dogs, grabbing people who the dogs sniff, seeing them, pick them, some poor guy's got a bag of cocaine on him, gets strip searched and arrested and all this kind of stuff, and then the cops will get in the van with me and then just go, I reckon we should legalise drugs, this is a load of bollocks. I think kind of, I've also seen police in courts ratchet up people's involvement in drug gangs to try and get bigger sentences for them. Sometimes there was one kid who had severe learning difficulties, and they were trying to make out that he was like the Mr. Big. And just seeing that happen it's just obvious. You can see the frustration in the cops, because they're so annoyed with getting beaten every day, not physically beaten, but beaten in this game, that they've got to kind of resort to this kind of stuff. And just topically, Hogan Howe has resigned today, hasn't he? Yeah. And I remember there was Hogan Howe's resign just reminded me of a classic police moment. So whenever there's some sort of law, I don't know what the name is, the knockdown, the door knocking law or something, but whenever police get cameras on a drug raid, and it all goes wrong, and I think Hogan Howe was announcing a big mass drug raid around London, and surprise, surprise, the flat that they break the door down of in some estate in Hackney or something, they spend about an hour trying to break it down, which is a classic, and so they look stupid. And then they go in there and they literally find a twiglet or something like that. and there's always the embarrassment afterwards going, was it the wrong house? So to me that kind of really sums up a lot of the kind of slightly clownish kind of stuff that goes on in this drug war. And also there's the kind of the TV cop shows that we've all seen, where you've got the cops, when they do eventually break down the door, they'll come in, there's some poor people in a council flat in Middlesbrough or Hull or whatever, great places to go, sorry, but they're living in this kind of fairly kind of dingy place to get their door knocked down and cameras in there, and the commentator is going like, look at these, basically, look at these scumbags, we're just going into their house, and they end up finding a kind of like 1/4 gram of speed in the cistern or something, and then the cameras go and the cops go and the door's knocked down, and they're just standing there going, huh? And this is entertainment, and it's part of this kind of moral attitude we have to drug use. And also just a slight bungling thing that police officers can do. You know, a couple of years ago, a teenager died, according to the newspapers and the police. It was all started from a police officer who told the newspapers that he died from taking nitrous oxide. So it was this poor kid who died all over every single newspaper in the country, and then it found out that he had a heart problem, but it was too late by then. Anyway, just a very... How long have I got now?
You've got 3 minutes.
Okay. Yes, so just to kind of sum up all this stuff about police and drugs, to me, the drug policing is an endless cycle that kind of feeds off itself. You've got the politicians, the media and the police all kind of winding each other up and convincing each other and themselves that it's a great idea. But it's all a bit of a sham. Now, you know, as I said before, there are some good drug police. You know, there are people who do a brilliant job looking after the most vulnerable people in our society and have probably saved many lives, but there are also some, probably most of them, who are literally kind of walking daily expresses with truncheons. And I'll go on to that later about the police's attitude to drug users, because there's been some great research by a guy called Richard Bacon on that. And in terms of trafficking, police are playing a game of cat and mouse with dealers. We all know as soon as they catch one bunch, right from the street level to the global level, another bunch comes in. And as I said, it's a kind of a black comedy. The more they make it harder for drugs to be trafficked, ironically, the more of a premium there is on the trafficked drugs, the more attractive it is to drug gangs. And on a street level, locking up drug users achieves nothing, does not put people off using drugs, does not improve their lives. It's really not a kind of it shouldn't be a thing for the police. There's much more important things for them to be doing. And are they wasted? Yes. Police deep down, they all know it. They're now really a kind of, apart from the odd big bust, they are kind of waste disposal unit. So whenever a member of the public rings them up going, oh, there's some drug dealers on my street, they'll come out and deal with it. But that's kind of, a lot of their time is spent doing this kind of, if someone moans about it, well, we'll do it. They should obviously concentrate on the violence. They shouldn't hassle people for a spliff and a ball of crack. And the fact is that people still are getting put into the criminal justice system for having one spliff. That is still going on. And just to sum up, I think the most important thing for me is that about the perception. So if you change the reason that the police have this bad attitude to drug users and drug dealers and anyone involved in drugs is because it's illegal, and police generally are quite like that. They are agents of the law. They follow the law. And I think a lot of the problem is based on the fact that where the law is. I think if you change the law, then you also change the police's attitude towards the most vulnerable members of society, which is a good thing. Yeah.
Great. Right. Can I begin by thanking all our speakers there for some really interesting observations. I want to open this up quite quickly to get your input and questions. I've been following Twitter. Nobody's asked a question on Twitter yet, so feel free to throw that in. But I have one question to get us going. So I noted that the word Daily Mail was mentioned 6 times by this panel. And part of me thinks, isn't that a bit of a cop-out? And shouldn't we be looking at ourselves? And it kind of, in one sense, goes to Tom's observation that we need to sort of make this low risk and raise it up in priorities. What else should we be doing, apart from blaming the media, or am I being too simplistic?
Actually, can I tell you a little story? Apparently, Paul Dacre, the editor of the Daily Mail, supports reform.
Right.
But he tells me that he's afraid of his grannies. As a granny, I suppose I have to understand that. In other words, he's just writing with his readers, and the material that we put out on 13th of September was very, very interesting. They wrote a brilliant article, Jonathan Gornall wrote it, on the Daily Mail website. Absolutely brilliant, wonderful. And then they had a news piece that was excoriating, if that's the right word, incredibly inaccurate, absolutely devastating to everything we're trying to do. And that's what he does. You know, he wants actually to get good stuff across, but he also wants to make sure that all his granny readers are sort of quite happy with what he's doing. So I think it is right. I think we've got to get across the research, and it's absolutely overwhelming now. And Val talked about it. We had Professor Mike Barnes did a review of all the research available internationally on the efficacy of cannabis in relation to a whole lot of different conditions. Brilliant report, totally clear and highly professional. And we're working with the Daily Mail, I have to say, to see whether they will come on board with a sort of campaign to support medicinal cannabis being legalised. So I'm wanting to be friendly to the Daily Mail actually right now.
Right. Any other thoughts, John?
Yeah, I think we need to think slightly more. Nuance is not the word, but there's a broader phenomenon here where this is something we see across Europe, with places with far more liberal drug policies than the UK, where drugs was maybe in the 1980s, 1990s in Switzerland, drugs was top 4 or 5 priorities for the population. It's not top 20 now. And part of that is it's genuinely just not a social emergency as it once was. And if we look for a counterexample, if anyone's following what's going on in the US right now, there's what's perceived as an opiate epidemic. And that has entirely changed that country's perception of drug addiction. And one of the reasons is the people who are being hit by the opiate epidemic are white, middle class, rural, or just non-traditional, i.e. they're not poor, black, minority, inner city people. And that's the big difference. That's what the reaction in the US in the 1980s to the crack epidemic was. These people are poor, these people are black, we should throw them in prison, and we should be unrelenting in chasing them down. What we're seeing now is an opiate epidemic, which is more middle-class white people, and the response is we have to have treatment, we have to have health services, we have to have an understanding, compassionate approach. And so I think this gets at a little bit of it. It is this old idea about drugs. It's not the drugs, it's who's perceived to use the drugs that often determines the policy around it.
Right, so we have a question here.
Yeah.
Can you lose the mics? Because we're getting this quite
Yeah. One thing I haven't heard mentioned is the psychoactive substances bill that was introduced this year. Silly a piece of legislation though it is, it does not criminalise possession. And it introduces an interesting scenario for the police, in which I presume unless it's obvious what the drug is, that they have to then prove that it is under the remit of the 71 Act in order to prosecute someone for possession. Is this, do you think, a sort of tacit recognition from the government that the criminalisation of drugs is failing?
Can I have a quick go at that? No, I don't think it is actually. I think that the Psychoactive Substances Act was a panicked, knee-jerk reaction within the current paradigm of drugs are bad, lock people up. It based on completely false evidence of the number of deaths attributed to psychoactive substances. I think it shows British policy making at its worst. It will be very confusing for police knowing, what is this substance, what should I do with it, and how to arrest people, or whether I should arrest or not. But for me, I was certainly surprised to see that the possession was not going to be the simple possession, but all the reductions apply, and all the rest of it would be criminalised. And I suppose you've got to say whatever the motivation is, and I don't know enough about who drew that up. Maybe somebody does. It is a good sign, but it's like one sweet-smelling rose in the cesspit. That is our. Just hold that image for a moment, because you're not going to smell the rose, are you? I'm not smelling the rose in that case. So I don't take too much comfort from it because I think it's an appalling fact, which almost every rational person who was commenting on it was saying, you know, whether from a medical perspective, legal perspective, enforcement perspective, said that it was wrong. But the other thing is, it also shows that in the face of the mounting evidence that prohibition doesn't work, they've effectively passed a prohibition act against psychoactive substances. Just crass and crazy.
Molly.
Yeah, I mean, one of my main concerns is use of drugs when people are too young. So, 12 to 16-year-olds is not a good idea. We know that from doing brain imaging with young kids, and we know that drugs have a different effect on the developing brain than they do in the adult brain. And I agree with Tom that the new psychoactive substances bill is unenforceable. Everyone in the law says that. But one thing it did do was close down the head shops. And a lot of guys in the head shops are really good about talking to the 12 and 13-year-olds and saying, actually, stay away from this, you can try that, it's all right with salvia, but don't go near this, and it's a shame because what it's done yet again is drive these things further and further away into the internet or wherever. And kids aren't getting the advice that they were getting before.
That's a good point. I think that I don't think that law was a knee-jerk thing. I think it was pretty careful. Part of it was carefully planned, and part of it wasn't. There was a lot of very good experts involved in that law. And basically, the reason that law came about was kind of two reasons. The main, the urgent reason was that the government was looking absolutely stupid. The fact that you had teenage kids falling over on the street after buying very potent drugs next door to Boots in the high street. So it's all over the local newspapers, screaming, like school kids buying very potent drugs falling over. But it made the government look completely stupid. So they had to do something about it. So one of the main purposes of this law was to stop head shops selling drugs on the streets. That was the number one purpose of this law. Then there was a secondary thing. They thought, right, okay, you also use the law to kind of try and sweep up this never-ending problem of legal highs constantly changing. So we just outlaw every drug, everything that gets you high, which is where they ran into problems and where they went into a kind of a hall of mirrors. What was that Kung Fu film? I can't remember. But they go to a hall of mirrors and they get completely confused because as we all know, it's unenforceable. No one quite knew what was a drug, what is being high, and it just kind of exposed the stupidity of the drug laws in the first place. And as I wrote about in Vice, already a year before that law was introduced in Blackburn, they had a head shop had closed, the main head shop in Blackburn. And what had happened is that the local drug dealer, the street drug dealer, the local crack and heroin dealer, they basically bought up the whole stock of the shop and sold it himself with free pies.
What I was going to say has already been said, so just very, very briefly. Yes, this law is completely unenforceable. We fought very hard in the House of Lords against it. But the only way to tackle new psychiatric substances is actually to have a rational set of policies in relation to traditional drugs, and that is what we will be pressing for. There was another point which I think I have got is the Irish introduced exactly the same bill about 12 years ago, and they've got more deaths from so-called new psychoactive substances in Northern Ireland than anywhere else in Europe, and we will go in the same direction because, as Val says, the head shops was some sort of safety. We now have none.
Great, thank you. So we have a question right at the back, and a question here and here. No, right at the back. Right.
Thanks very much. I have a question about the law, and you mentioned the moral aspect to bring in the example of psychiatry, where obviously there's sort of careful use of drugs which are psychoactive, and I speak as a psychiatrist. Obviously the Mental Health Act is often used to enforce treatment with drugs which unfortunately are not often, sometimes are found to be quite unpleasant by the people that take them, hence the need to enforce it with a Mental Health Act for those individuals' own good. And there seems to be a moral imperative to do that because there's a diagnosis which needs treatment. The point I was going to make really is in a sense, I suppose that's part of the hypocrisy we're describing, and there's a need to have an open debate about which drugs are actually harmful to people's brains, people's experience of living, and the pluses and minuses, and to sort of draw that out into the public domain. Obviously, the issue of psychiatrists prescribing is quite a protected and separate area from most discourse, and also it's shrouded in certain stigma and discrimination. People with diagnoses do not want to particularly contribute to a public debate, and where there's a Mental Health Act used, often things that patients say are often not viewed as worth hearing, unfortunately, because that person is not in their right mind, etc. So it's the moral aspect, where some drugs that are used are seen as morally okay, even if they're unpleasant and potentially harmful. There's an important paper in Nature which shows that antipsychotics do have harmful effects, which all psychiatrists know now. But obviously it's a balance issue in terms of what benefits that may have in terms of serious psychological presentations that people may have.
I think you make a really interesting moral point. I think what the issues you've raised as psychiatrists would take a whole debate on in themselves. It's a really massive area you're addressing. And as you know, the brain doesn't distinguish between a legal drug, a drug used to treat psychosis, and an illegal drug. And in fact, another part of this whole debate, as I'm sure you're very aware, is that we're now looking at treatments in psychiatry for mental illness, such as, perhaps the most significant development in psychiatry in the last 50 years in treatment is that ketamine can make people who have not responded to any antidepressant in their life suddenly respond. So ketamine, which is known on the street as the horse tranquilizer, can actually be the most effective antidepressant. Every other antidepressant takes 3 to 4 weeks to work, as you know, but ketamine works within an hour. So there's so many of those things. We're still using heroin, diamorphine, treating pain conditions. And so it's very artificial, this idea that some psychoactive substances are okay, you can use them to treat disorders, and others aren't. There's such a shady area in the middle. It's coming out a lot now with cannabis research, where we're finding cannabinoids can treat childhood epilepsy, it can treat addiction, and even psychosis. So it's a very kind of murky world. I know I've only answered like a tiny little bit of your question, but do respond if you want, or if anyone else.
Anybody else on the panel?
Can I just say that quickly? Yeah, I mean, the reason there is this bizarre, invented divide is because this divide was made up, over 100 years ago, kind of chiefly for reasons of racism. So these were the drugs that are now illegal: cannabis, cocaine, opium, heroin, etc. were drugs that were connected. It was all about people who used those drugs, and the lawmakers back then wanted to attack them and attack the drugs they were using, and that's why you have this odd split.
Can I just say only one thing? For people not familiar with mental health, I think we just ought to make clear that a psychiatrist can only require a patient to take an antipsychotic against their will if that person is a serious risk to themselves or someone else. Otherwise you can't do it, can you? The thing that really excites me is Val Curran's research in terms of CBD, possibly, as I think you would say, being as effective as an antipsychotic for schizophrenia psychosis, and with no real side effects, as far as I understand it, or minimal. It would be a revolution in psychiatry if only Val's work comes to fruition and we can have CBD available.
Right, got a question here?
Policy seems to be created shaped by what the general voting population want. And the general voting population, without sounding conciliatory, are quite often misinformed by the media. But why do you think that there is this, like paradigm Tom was saying about drugs are bad, a lot of people are a drug user? Why do you think that the sort of general voting population that don't take drugs, where does this kind of idea that altering your consciousness is sinful, other than alcohol and tobacco? Like, why is it sort of seen as a sin in society to alter your consciousness using anything other than alcohol and tobacco?
Okay, who wants to take that?
It's crazy. There's no reason.
I think it is simply, it's the other. It's unknown. It's not mainstream, and therefore it is something to be afraid of. I do think it's also tied in with there were rising patterns among certain populations at certain periods, and those drugs are now inevitably linked to those kind of populations and everything that they stand for. So if you're middle class English, you're very afraid of this idea of being labelled a working class heroin user. I think that those kind of, you can't dismiss those kind of mental, those personalised mental processes that people have around substances. And as I said, the Daily Mail brandies are very opposed to any sort of relaxation on these substances until they get a grandchild or a child who's in some way involved in them, and then they can change their tune very quickly. Other people's kids should go to jail for drugs. My kids shouldn't go to jail for drugs. I want to come back a little bit on what was just said, on things like why isn't heroin, why is heroin prohibited and why are other drugs allowed and because it's racist. Heroin is not prohibited. The only reason that heroin is not used widely in the UK to treat drug dependence is because the government thinks it's too expensive. In the morning, the UK Health Service could roll out heroin-assisted treatment, but they think it's too expensive to do so. And quite literally, I have heard this said, not quite by the Home Office, but people who work with the Home Office, these people's lives are not worth that much. It's not worth investing that much, especially when we're having austerity in the health service. So I think we need to keep that in mind. As I said, this is all kind of a grey area about which drugs are used. No drugs are absolutely prohibited under all circumstances. So there was a lot of political and resource constraints go into decisions about how drugs are used and how they interrelate with society. So I just want to keep that in mind a little bit.
I'll just add one quick fact. The demographics has changed. The baby boom generation, most of them had weed. And I'm just writing a report at the moment, and 42% of French people have used cannabis. It's about 37% of the Brits. It's not a kind of, we're getting a bit sexist with these Daily Mail grannies. A lot of people actually have experience beyond alcohol and tobacco.
Yeah, just going back to the kind of why is there this kind of stigma about getting out of it. I think it was this guy called Jack Derrida, who I'm just reading up about at the moment. And he mentioned that kind of, especially with non-alcohol drugs, there was almost this feeling that if you're having a good time, but it's an artificial good time, and it's a good time kind of not with everyone else, it's kind of a good time away from the usual good time, as in dancing around the maypole or whatever, then that's kind of somehow a suspicious thing to be doing. because it's not real good time, it's not wholesome good time, it's slightly spooky, demonic good time. And I just also, you know, obviously there is a split between alcohol, and you're allowed to, you know, alcohol is a big part of our culture and good for it. But I just kind of, even with alcohol, even though we are very open about it, there is still this kind of slight shyness about, ooh, tipsy, you know, it's all a bit shy, about, oh, you know, I had a little bit, it felt a bit woozy. And so there's still this, even with alcohol, which is part of our lifeblood in this country, there's still a bit of shyness about getting into an altered state.
So we got a question here, and one directly behind you, one over here, and one at the back there. So we got all of hands coming out. Can I just ask some questions, Vic? Can you try to sort of focus in on the topic, you know, about policy and use of law enforcement to address drug policy?
I'll be concise.
Yeah.
Right, my question really, first of all I'd like to thank all the speakers for coming here, very informative speeches from all of you. My question is about institutional bias really. I've heard this mentioned anecdotally from pretty much all of the speakers, that their lives aren't really worth that much. Only after the opiate epidemic has affected white middle class males will they do something about it. The police will only do something if someone moans about it. Narcomania being described as something that affects the underclass and some upper class pleasure seekers. So would you agree that there's a distinct element of classism in the drugs world? I would especially like to hear from Baroness Meacher. It's your unique position to answer this question, being on the All-Party chair of the All-Party Parliamentary.
I really do very strongly feel there's a strong class issue throughout this whole debate, and one of the reasons it's so difficult to get any reform, because somehow middle class people feel safe. I mean, the obvious example of this is that apparently in the city, I have not worked in the city, you can go to any pub and get cocaine at the bar. And any banker can get their cocaine and they take it regularly. No police go anywhere near, they must know this is happening, but some black guy in Brixton, you just watch out because you'll be got. So yes, it's absolutely clear. It's a class issue.
Any other comments on that? Max, any comments?
Yes, there has been research done on that by the well-known one done by Release, which proved that black people and also poor people were way more likely to get stopped in the first place, searched, arrested and convicted. So all the way down the line, there's proof that this is happening. And then when you kind of look at when you set that aside and you go, okay, well, do poor, you know, black people, do they take more? Is there more drug use? No, there isn't. There is more problem drug use in poor areas. But there is, yeah, there's a complete kind of slant there. And I also just, you know, it's another situation where you've got not only drug users, but drug dealers are a lot more likely to come from poor communities, because a lot of the time they are locked out of the mainstream economy. And what do you do if you're locked out? And then you've got to find your own way of doing things, and the most common way of doing that is the drug market. But then again, you know, you've got people from a very, very young age. I think it's about a fifth to a quarter of people convicted for Class A drug dealing are under 21. So there's a lot of kind of sometimes very vulnerable young people here getting convicted for kind of having to move into this trade with little choice of their own.
Tom?
Yeah, I think that the question, I agree that there is a certain element of classism. Again, I do feel the police are put in this very difficult position, but I'm not suggesting that every time in that position they behave perfectly. That would be stupid. But if you like, the circumstances are such that the police basically operate on the street, and there's the gang of the police, and there's other people on the streets who are not the gang of the police, and it inevitably comes into conflict. And drug law enforcement is a great way of getting in the face of people that you are sort of controlling. And I don't like that as an aspect of policing, but the policing is to an extent legitimised by the Misuse of Drugs Act in stopping and searching. And as I said, I remember once, this is relevant because it's a contrast, is that I was called to a disturbance at the Duke Street Hotel in Mayfair, which occurred during a ladies' night at a Masonic dinner. And no, I'm not a Mason, never had been and all that. But the point was, two women were fighting over a gift teddy bear that was on the table. Now, can I say that the reason I'm saying that is it's highly unusual for the police to get involved in what might be termed that stratum of society. Most of the time, we were out there on the streets, dealing with overdoses, dealing with casual violence, dealing with low-level crime, and because the drugs market is criminalised, there's criminality all around associated with it. It is definitely the biggest cause of police work. If you think about maybe 70% of acquisitive crime, shoplifting, theft, all the rest of it, it can be attributed to feeding the drug market, then it's almost inevitable. And instead, those people, if you're rich and you've got a drug problem, you can usually buy your way to some degree of safety. Not always. If you're poor, you can't. And I want to make a general point, because people talk about legal drugs and legalising cannabis. If I talk about legal tables or illegal tables or a war on tables, it doesn't make sense. Have no mistake that this is a war on people. This is a war on people's liberty. This is a war on people's right to choose things. And so what I object to is that the police, who ought to be everybody's friend, are actually actively deployed to limit unreasonably, against the evidence, the freedoms of citizens in this country. And that's the real disgrace. It's not illegal drugs. It is impinging on the freedom of individuals.
Okay.
As a former chief constable and former police officer yourself, what kind of advice do you have for police officers on the street, be they specials, constables, who love their job but hate drug enforcement, want to exercise their discretion, but find that they're mostly unable to, be that because of supervisors, seniors, or just their colleagues? What kind of practical advice do you have for officers in that situation?
So, can we just hold that on to... So there's a lady right at the back. Yes? You want to shout or...?
I can shout.
Yep.
I was just wondering what you thought about the fact that the war on drugs is a huge infringement on the human rights of specifically people with mental health conditions, because of the fact that it criminalises illness in the case of addiction, but also denies treatment because of the restrictions on research and thus the ability to administer the appropriate treatments for these people. What you thought about that affecting that specific group of people?
Okay, so we got a question of advice to young police officers, question on issues again around mental health. We had a question over here. Yep.
Yeah, we've spoken a lot about how there are requirements for reform. I was just wondering what people's opinion was on what does the ideal situation look like when reform has happened. Is it Portugal or is it, a kind of nuance of that?
Okay, so we've got 3 questions there. Maybe I'll ask Tom to kick off on that.
Thanks. It's a difficult one. I've wrestled with this myself, and so perhaps if I reflect on my own thinking was that I have to keep on getting promoted because I kept on having children. And actually, I got promoted more times than I had children. I've only got 4 children. But the point is that there are lots of things about policing where you can do good and you can help. Drug law enforcement causes a great deal of work and effort, but you can not specialise. Don't look too hard. Don't stop and search people in the street. And understand. In fact, on my WordPress blog, I wrote a piece, a letter that a chief constable might write to his staff, explaining some of the things we've been talking about, how you can look at this differently, how you can see somebody who may be stealing from his grandmother but is actually doing that for a very good reason. I would say don't sacrifice your career for that particular principle, but that's obviously a personal choice. You might do more good by staying in and engaging with colleagues in the same way that I hope you all put your hands up saying things need to change. I hope you're not the only people in this university or in this city or in this country who are like that. And part of this is about engaging and discussing. And I used to do that with my colleagues and the like. And as Max has said, from getting engaged with police officers, right now, I mean, I've been retired for 10 years, I think work from the inside and challenge, get promoted, get in positions of authority as I did. And I think now, as a result, in my particular case, I think I can be a more powerful advocate as a former chief, and I can open doors otherwise I wouldn't have done. So it's a really good question. Of course, there's no really simple answer to that, but I would say don't give up your career. And by the way, if you want to join the police, it is still a good career. Ladies, not you, you're asking on behalf of a friend, perhaps. So the difficult one is a really good question, but I think working from inside and changing attitudes. Just quickly, infringement on human rights. Oh, you bet. I mean, of course it is. And yes, people with mental illness, it's just crazy. Others will have more sort of technical things to say about that. But just as a police officer sworn to uphold the law and serve the people, this Misuse of Drugs Act and the whole attitude to people. But perhaps just one thought. Police officers are human, and everybody is prejudiced in the sense that you go through the world making your mind up about things in advance. It's rather like I don't test for the strength of each chair I sit on. I just tend to assume it will be there. In the same way, a police officer could just form the view that, if you're a young black man on the street that late at night, you might well be seeking to rob somebody, because the vast majority of reports, certainly at one time, were young black men. And the mistake made was the false logic was to go from the fact that because some people do that, everybody does. And police do fall into that trap, I suspect, as all human beings do. And so we've got to do something about that, because police officers have a great deal of authority. At the same time, we have to understand it. And one of my roles as a former police officer is trying to bring drug activists and NGOs in other parts of the world, like in Latin America, get them talking to the police and trying to understand each other, because that way you can actually achieve some understanding rather than hatred. The ideal situation is quite simple for me. It is a graduated access and regulation system for all substances that human beings might want to consume. So we don't have the artificial divide. We know that if you buy a bottle of Coca-Cola, at least you know it's got sort of like 10 spoonfuls of sugar in it, but it does say so on the label, so you know what you're getting. So it's the same with food. I think all substances that we might want to take to alter our consciousness or whatever it is will to benefit from the same type of regulation. But clearly, there should be age limits about access to certain substances, to eat or drink, as there are at the moment. And we ought to be thinking about, in some instances, substances have to be very carefully controlled. But I'd say just a sliding scale, end of prohibition, proper education and advice.
Right, thank you. Well,
I'll try to keep this short. On the human rights issue, yes, a lot of people who take illegal drugs do have serious mental health problems of one sort or another, and patients used to say to me when I was working in the mental health field, I take cannabis because although it may make my voices work, it helps me to feel human, and that's why I take it. It always struck me as being extraordinary that these people then turned into criminals once they left our hospital units. On the issue, where should, second point, where we now have this major research evidence that not only mentally ill people, but a lot of people suffering from chronic, lifelong, terrible, chronic neuropathic pain who could use cannabis to great effect cannot get it. That is a major human rights issue, and that is what we'll be fighting on. On the what would policy look like in the end, my belief is we need to go on building an evidence base in relation to specific drugs and so on. Portugal approved that decriminalisation works, we should implement that. Switzerland have proved that heroin clinics with clean heroin and the rest work, and they save money. I think it was Tom said, governments won't do it because it's expensive, but these things save state money. It should be done because we've got the evidence very, very clear. Medicinal cannabis, I think there's now adequate evidence, lots and lots of evidence. Push ahead with that. Other drug policies, I would suggest let's go on building evidence and make sure that we reduce addiction, reduce violence, reduce corruption, and improve people's lives and improve health and well-being of the population, because we know from research that these policies work in that direction. So that would be the way I would go.
I think that was a mega answer by Molly, and she's answered all those questions together. But I just wanted to point out one additional thing, because I agree with her, is that in countries where they have used policy change, they've sometimes actually helped public mental health. So one of the things we know now about America, in the states where they've legalised cannabis, compared to states where they haven't, is that, someone said before, the opiate problem in the states is huge. Prescription opiate addiction is massive. You've heard all about Michael Jackson and other people. It's an enormous problem. 2 years ago, more kids started using prescription opiates than started using marijuana. Now, what's happened in the states where they've legalised cannabis is this opiate abuse issue has gone right down. It's really had a beneficial effect. A mega reduction in people having opiate problems because they're now using cannabis. It's that similar thing happened years ago when in the Netherlands they introduced the cannabis cafes. The number of crashes with drivers being drunk reduced by 40%. So these policies, I think we should be doing a lot more to do the research on changing policies, how it affects the world. You know, they can actually have these really positive results.
Yeah, maybe I'm just, like I have to say, I agree with what everyone has said. Like, I think the framework Molly laid out is about as good as one as you'll get in drug policy. It's an incremental reformist direction. I just caution, let's not be overly deterministic about drugs. It's that a lot of the problems that we talk about are deep structural issues in society to do with inequality and classism and poverty and things like that. They're not going to disappear overnight if you change the drug laws. But I think, yes, you're going to reduce the harms of society. A lot of the drug laws generate a class of harms onto themselves, which don't need to be there, and you can diminish them. And I think a little bit of this qualifies what Tom was saying, or at least I was interested in your perspective on it, because it's cannabis policing is effectively its control of problematic communities. That's why the police still find functional value of it. It's that we have a power over groups of young males that we want to have some power over. So I think we need to recognize some of the institutional forces that keep it in place, and they vary. So if you look at New York, the exact same phenomenon as London, 50,000 marijuana arrests per year over the 2000s. It's gone down now. 90 to 95% of those were young black or male Hispanics. No white people were getting arrested. It was all black or Hispanic males. And part of the driver was police had targets that they had to meet. They had to arrest a certain number of people. They didn't want to arrest injecting drug users because that was unpleasant, and young black males were easier to, were not as problematic to arrest. There was all those kind of bizarre institutional drivers. This is something we see across drug policy, whether it's eradication, which sprays parts of the rainforest with toxins, even though it doesn't work, but it's perceived to be doing something. There's all of these kind of idiosyncratic things as well that you spot when you get involved in drug policy. So I just wanted to broaden some of those thoughts out a bit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next? Yeah.
Can I have a quick thing? Yeah, all right. So yeah, I think you sort of mentioned Portugal there, which is, you know, it's a good template. I mean, there's been some reports saying it's the most amazing thing ever, not true. Some reports saying it's the worst thing ever, not true. It's been a success on a number of levels, but it hasn't been some sort of runaway kind of paradise kind of thing either. But it's a good template to follow. And I think this country very soon actually will, and led by the police actually, will bring in a form of decriminalisation, but they will not call it decriminalisation. It will be kind of smuggled in as a kind of under some sort of other name. And I know, we know the police forces some are being open about it, some are just doing it anyway. Some are doing it with the backing of the Home Office, but they're just not, they're not first-time arrests, any drugs. They're taking people for a chat with kind of counsellors rather than arresting them and this kind of stuff. So I think that will happen, but it won't be huge headlines, the government going, we are doing this. It will be smuggled in, because that's the way the British government does its drug policy, is that it's actually a bit more liberal than it likes to say it is. It will spend a lot more time, it has done, especially over, with the National Treatment Agency, a lot of money on heroin treatment. They won't particularly shout out about it because it doesn't want the sort of press to have a go at all this money being spent. And just a thing on the copper, the police person, you were saying how could a police officer who didn't want to play the usual game in the drug policing drugs, and there are a lot of police officers who do turn a blind eye when others don't. So to a lot of kind of cannabis offences, police would just walk up to it, smell the ganja in a kind of a football pitch, see a load of kids and just go, I can't be bothered. And so it's totally fine for a police officer who doesn't want to do all that stuff, just go, I can't be bothered. Because it's not a target for police anymore. And they don't really keep the waste of paperwork. And also that there are a lot of officers who do actually help very vulnerable people and do help homeless people. They do help dependent heroin users. There's not that many of them, but they are there. And there's room for people who do give a shit about these people to do a good job. And that just leads me to the last point is, mental health is absolutely entangled in problem drug use. Obviously heroin is a huge painkiller, and for some people take it to heal or to cover over trauma. And so there's absolutely a link up to mental health, problem drug use and homelessness as well.
Right, so I've got a question here, then the lady behind you. Any others? One over here. So, yeah.
Okay, great. That leads beautifully onto my first part of my question, which is I really appreciate you guys being here. Thanks for your time. I appreciate there's no silver bullet. There is no one solution for all. The government, in their infinite wisdom, have tried these, as we've seen with the Psychedelics Act, the one rule for all. So my question is, what do you see being the linchpin for change? What do you see being, I hate to say, I'm a little bit ashamed to be British because we seem to be following very much so at the moment. So who do you think will follow? Do you think it'll be the US? Do you think it'll be Germany? More widespread Europe? If they implement the law changes that we're here today to discuss, who will we follow on?
Right, thank you.
Sorry, actually, I have a second part of the question that no one has brought up. Do any of you know what Bitcoin is? This is a serious question because it actually comes into the class warfare as well. I'm a very privileged white middle class man, and I have access to this knowledge that I can purchase my very clean and quality drugs online, and I have a system in place where other users review the drugs and any scam artists are very quickly weeded out. It also makes my job very, very cheap because there's a mass market, there's always competition. Obviously, when we're talking about the street, we're talking about a very different game, where violence is used. But this is a technology that's becoming more widespread, more easily accessible. I can probably order some drugs to my home on my telephone whilst we sit here. How do you believe that rapid advancement of technology will fall into this argument? Especially when we're talking about analogues of drugs that the Psychoactive Drugs Act tried to cover because of the rapid advancement.
Okay, so two questions in one. Behind you.
I'm going to have a very quick question myself, but it's very short. Would we see policy reform accelerated if there was a police crackdown on drug use in Westminster?
I work in substance misuse, and it's not really a question as such, just to agree with the mental health, but everything else, domestic violence, benefits, everything needs to change, because the people I'm working with, they're not sitting around having a laugh with their friends getting high. It's medicine and it's an escape. And how can you sit opposite someone and say, well, you know, you can't do that when we're not offering them anything else? And sending these people to prison just makes, when they come into recovery, they now can't get a job. And forcing people into rehab doesn't work. People have to want to, you know, change and have to be able to cope with their lives. So the legal status of a drug doesn't matter to these people. It's irrelevant to people who have a problem with substance abuse.
Thank you. One question over here. Sorry.
So you very rightly pointed out, obviously you need to raise the profile, raise the priority of, in order to get reform, and also pointed out that this is costing £10 billion a year to police and possibly estimated around about £6 billion a year in possible revenue. Good for yourself and probably you, Baroness Meacher, in talking to policymakers, have you ever put forward the economic argument of the amount of money that could be saved by wasting police time and money, and possibly the amount of tax revenue that can be made by eventually working towards legalisation, regulation and taxation, and what's on the response?
Okay, thank you. So a range of questions. Anybody want to pick one of those up? Yeah.
Well, the last one, on medicinal cannabis, we want to do some work on the cost to the NHS for people, all these people with chronic pain, having a lot of prescribed drugs that don't work. They're therefore forever going into hospital, having specialist appointments, having GP appointments, etc. Huge costs of these chronic illnesses, where cannabis, for a number of, not all of them, but a lot of them, would work very effectively. So we want to present a strong economic argument, frankly. That's the main thing. I don't know whether there's anything else. I just agree with the person who said drugs are a medicine. A lot of people take drugs when they've had very, very damaging early lives, a lot of social deprivation and the rest of it. These people need holistic care and treatment, and that's what the Swiss heroin treatment clinics do, and that's what we should be doing.
Is Molly going to address the question of crackdown of drugs in Westminster?
I don't think I'm confident to do that.
What about this issue about technology?
If they found a whole lot of
Have a quick word about the online trade.
Yes.
Yeah, so I thought you said Bitcoin. Bitcoin, yeah?
Yeah.
Bitcoin, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, the online trade, which kind of all kicked off with, in earnest, it kicked off about in 2009 with methadone in the UK, actually. I mean, it had been around for a long time, but it really kind of shit hit the fan in 2009 with methadone. And it was actually proven that the tabloid scare stories about methadone actually helped spread it basically created a methadone epidemic. Because I wrote an article about this and I checked out the Google searches for buying methadone. Whenever there was a Sun story going, methadone, this, that, methadone, that, meow, meow, do this, do that. Every single day, on the exact day of that article, where can I buy methadone buy, searches on Google went crazy. So yeah, so this spawned this whole new online drug trade, which is a game changer for me. You know, it's the final nail in the coffin for enforcement of the drug trade. We've got to remember that it's a very small part of the global drug trade. Most of it is traditional trade, but it's an absolute game changer. I mean, if you can't stop drugs coming into traditional drug trade, if you can only get kind of 1% of what's going around, 1 to 10% of the drugs coming into this country, if you can't stop drugs getting into prisons, then how are you supposed to police billions of emails and websites and parcels? The police must be looking at that and saying, we're fucked.
Yeah. Okay. That's a top.
You just saying what we think. just adding emphasis, because I mean that's a very suitable adjective or way of describing the situation. Technology, and there's a big issue that made it difficult for police is when mobile phones started appearing, and people could arrange the deal. You know, whereas before it was much harder. In fact, the life of I know a few people who have problematic heroin users, and their life is hard because they have to spend a lot of time raising the money because often they haven't got a job or homeless and they'll resort to crime or prostitution or whatever. And in one case, you remember the 5 women who were murdered in Ipswich? Yeah, well, certainly one of those went out to work as a prostitute in order to get the money, and she was killed at that time. So this is sort of just another example of the harm of this. But it also shows that because the money's there, really drug law enforcement is irrelevant in terms of its impact on the market, but it's hugely damaging in terms of its impact on people and society and the waste. When Nixon introduced his public enemy number 1 drugs in 1971 as a political ploy, and as what his Haldeman subsequently revealed was actually a racist motivation. By the way, read Joan Harry's Chasing the Scream, if you haven't already. It's a terrifically good read, but it goes back into the history as well as the present day, and if it's a sort of book that people who aren't interested in drugs can read, because the man can write. So technology will just be harnessed, and drug law enforcement becomes irrelevant in that regard. You may recall, you'll be too young, Jack Straw. Any remember Jack Straw? Yeah, his son was sort of gotten a sting, etc. Well, I had a private conversation with Jack Straw. Jack, it's no longer private. Well, it's not going to be, because he basically agreed with me that I was the chief superintendent at Belgravia then in the Met, and we had this discussion about cannabis, and he said, oh, it's a nonsense. But there's no traction, there's no clamour for it, it's not something I really want to get engaged in. But the point you made, in maybe a slightly sort of facetious question, is actually, if the police targeted either MPs themselves or a few relatives, that would absolutely shake things up. Now, I'm not suggesting that as a tactic, and it won't happen under Bernard Hogan-Howe, but maybe his successor will see the need. In fact, a pal of mine, a chap called Ian Blair, now Lord Blair, he actually, when he first got to office, said, I'm going to have a go at the middle-class cocaine users. And I said to him, ridiculous, of course you're not. But he was highlighting the fact that they were immune, and it's only the poor people on the street, or the medicinal cannabis users who get busted for growing a few plants as a medicine. So that's the point. Look, can I just make a general point, because I'm not sure, maybe I'm underestimating your knowledge of this, but people talk about decriminalisation and legalisation, this and the other. You've either got complete prohibition, or you've got decriminalisation, where individual users are not criminally punished, but the market is still illegal, and that's the situation in Portugal. And that's not enough for me, because I think you should go to a controlled and regulated market, as I briefly described. And then the 4th position is selling like sweets. But there is a real difference between, people often talk about, I even ask questions on the radio, do you agree with decriminalising or is it legalising? People just don't know, but I think it's important to understand that there really is, there is a difference. The economic argument that Molly talked about, I think we need to do the same with police, and I think we'll do that with people like Ron Hogg and other police and crime commissioners. They set the strategic plan and the annual plan for policing, and I see this as an entry point. In fact, I'm like a lot of you perhaps, I write a blog that nobody reads, but this particular blog was about how a police and crime commissioner could set the strategic priorities for police, which would basically be harm reduction objectives, and get rid of targets. Targets are always bad. There's a whole 3 hours a day you do on targets. And so get police working towards harm reduction objectives rather than simple measures of arrest and seizure.
Okay. Molly, you wanted to say something very briefly?
One point.
Yeah.
Tom is saying, to legalise things, regulate things. I do think we should have the research. There are many different models of regulation. Colorado is completely different from Uruguay or indeed even Washington. If we get regulation introduced, the wrong kind of regulation with not the right constraints and so on, it could set the whole agenda back decades, whereas I think if we go very carefully and get some good evaluation of these different models and then make sure this country introduces a good model, then I think we can go forward.
I was really talking about the end product, not the process. I agree with you.
Yeah.
A steady, careful, evidence-based process,
Yeah.
but the end will be a regulation system that works here. So I think we are in.
Okay, so I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to start wrapping up. I want to thank our panel, but one of the sort of observations I've made, I have this little badge in my pocket, which you won't be able to see, but it says, "I love evidence" on it. And I was given it the other day. I should probably wear it more often. But listening to this debate, it does strike me in one sense that the whole debate around drug policy is almost a leading indicator on the so-called post-truth democracy that we're increasingly entering, and that's quite worrying because we clearly have the evidence, we clearly have the data, but we can't get through what that evidence and what that data is and use that to inform policy. It's quite sobering, I think, for not just for drug policy, but for the whole of public policy and evidence-based policy making. But can I ask you to give a round of applause to our panel who've been outstanding. Outstanding, so clap yourselves. And to David King over here, who's organised this event and pulled it all together. Big round of applause. So thank you all very much and safe travels home.